Clint Eastwood, a Hollywood legend, decides to take a simple flight without attracting attention. But a young billionaire, confident in his superiority, begins to despise him. He doesn't know who he's dealing with. What happens on board will silence the passengers and make the billionaire reconsider his entire life. Los Angeles International Airport was as lively as ever, a chaotic symphony of rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, and boarding announcements echoing from the speakers. Among the crowd stood Clint Eastwood, a man who had long left his mark on Hollywood and beyond. Dressed in a worn leather jacket, faded jeans, and a classic cowboy hat, he carried himself with the kind of quiet confidence that only a lifetime of experience could bring. He was here for a simple flight, just another journey, but what awaited him was anything but ordinary. As he stood in line for the first-class boarding, he couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between himself and the other passengers. Men in sharp suits, women in designer outfits, all projecting wealth and status. Clint, on the other hand, looked like a man who had just stepped off a ranch after a long day of work. Behind him in line stood Victor Devereaux, a self-made billionaire in his early 30s. Dressed in an impeccably tailored navy blue suit, polished shoes that gleamed under the airport lights, and a Rolex that seemed designed to catch attention, Victor radiated arrogance. Every movement he made, every glance he gave, carried the weight of someone who believed the world revolved around him. Victor scanned the line and quickly spotted Clint. His eyes narrowed as he took in the older man's appearance. It didn't take long before he made a comment, loud enough for Clint to hear. "First class, huh? They really let just anyone in these days," he muttered with a smirk. Clint, unfazed, turned his head slightly and met Victor's gaze. His eyes, sharp as ever, didn't waver. Instead, he simply nodded. "The world's full of surprises, son," Clint said calmly. Victor expected a different reaction, maybe some stammering or an embarrassed chuckle, but Clint's response was as steady as a rock. There was no irritation, no attempt at defense, just a quiet self-assurance that unsettled Victor more than he cared to admit. The line started moving as the first-class passengers were called to board. Victor made sure to stride forward with purpose, exuding an air of importance. Clint, in contrast, walked at a steady, unhurried pace, as if he had all the time in the world. Upon entering the plane, Victor glanced at his ticket once more and looked up, only to see Clint settling into the seat right next to his. He froze. "You've got to be kidding me," Victor muttered under his breath, shaking his head as he took his seat beside Clint. Clint turned to him with that same relaxed demeanor and offered a small smile. "Looks like we're traveling together, partner." Victor crossed his arms, clearly irritated. He had anticipated a peaceful flight, maybe some networking with influential businessmen. But instead, he was stuck next to a man who looked like he belonged on the set of a Western rather than in first class. As economy passengers began to board, Victor decided he wasn't going to let the situation go without some commentary. "So," he began, leaning slightly toward Clint, "what do you do for a living?" Clint, who had just been adjusting his carry-on bag under the seat in front of him, looked up and met Victor's eyes. "I work in film." Victor raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Oh, commercials? Independent stuff?" Clint gave a small smile and shook his head. "Something like that." Victor let out a short laugh. "Interesting. I've always found it fascinating how people try to fit into places they don't belong. First class, for example. Not everyone is meant to be here." Clint simply nodded, letting Victor's words hang in the air before responding. "I think we all end up where we're meant to be." Victor smirked. "That's a nice thought. Kind of philosophical. But real life doesn't work that way." Clint didn't respond immediately. He just turned his gaze toward the window, as if the conversation had already ended in his mind. But Victor wasn't finished. Victor continued, "There are places money can't buy, but first class isn't one of them. Some of us work hard to earn our place here, while others, well, let's just say luck plays a bigger role for them." Clint finally turned back toward Victor, his expression unchanged. There was a patience in his eyes, as if he had heard words like these 1,000 times before. Instead of reacting with anger, he simply studied the young billionaire for a moment before speaking. "Luck, hard work. Either way, we all land in the same place when the flight's over, don't we? Victor let out a scoffing laugh. That's a nice sentiment, old man, but not exactly accurate. Some of us land in better places than others. Clint leaned forward slightly, crossing his arms. I figure the value of a seat ain't about what you have, it's about how you treat people. The words hung in the air like a quiet challenge. Some of the surrounding passengers, who had been subtly listening, exchanged glances. Even the flight attendant, who was walking past, slowed down slightly, as if considering whether she should step in. Victor, however, let out another chuckle, shaking his head. That's good. First-class philosophy. Maybe you should start giving motivational speeches. Clint gave a small nod, as if acknowledging Victor's attempt at humor, then turned back toward the window, signaling that the conversation was over, for now. The flight attendant approached with the first round of drinks. Victor made sure to be noticed. A glass of your finest champagne, he said confidently, flashing a winning smile. The flight attendant nodded with a polite but slightly strained smile, accustomed to such requests. When she turned to Clint, he made a simple request. Just water, please. Victor looked at Clint, his smirk widening. Water? In first class? Don't tell me you're going to waste the experience. Clint took the bottle the flight attendant handed him and replied, I'm fine with this. Sometimes simplicity's enough. Victor narrowed his eyes, as if trying to decipher the meaning behind Clint's words. But before he could make another comment, an announcement came over the speakers, signaling the final boarding call. Passengers settled into their seats, and the plane doors were secured. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, Victor stole another glance at Clint. There was something about the older man's calmness that unsettled him. Not because he was loud or demanding, but because he wasn't. No matter how much Victor tried to assert his dominance, Clint remained steady, like a mountain unaffected by the wind. Victor was convinced that he had control of the situation, but the truth was that things were only just beginning. What seemed like a simple conversation would soon become something much bigger, something that would leave the entire plane in stunned silence and change Victor's perspective forever. And he had no idea it was coming. The plane had taken off smoothly, gliding into the sky as the city lights of Los Angeles faded into the night below. Clint Eastwood sat comfortably in his seat, staring out of the window, unbothered by the grandeur of first class. The hum of the engines provided a rhythmic backdrop to the unfolding situation beside him. Victor Devereaux, still irritated by Clint's presence, sipped his champagne with an air of entitlement. He was used to being in control, accustomed to situations where his wealth and confidence dictated the course of interactions. Yet, despite his best efforts, Clint remained unaffected, and that irked him more than he cared to admit. As the flight attendants moved through the cabin offering appetizers, Victor watched Clint decline the luxurious options and simply accept a small plate of nuts. Victor, on the other hand, indulged in caviar and foie gras, making sure to let everyone around him know how exquisite his tastes were. You know, Victor said, turning towards Clint as he took another sip of his champagne. I've always believed that money separates those who succeed from those who just exist. Clint turned his gaze from the window, looking at Victor with a calm expression. That's so. Victor smirked, adjusting his cufflinks. Absolutely. Money buys opportunity, influence, and, most importantly, power. People respect you when they know you've got wealth. The world's not built on kindness. It's built on winners and losers. Clint let the words hang in the air for a moment before responding. I've met plenty of men with money. Some of them were real men. Others were just boys playing dress-up. Victor let out a short laugh, but there was an underlying unease in his tone. And I suppose you think money doesn't matter? Clint shrugged. Depends on what you value. Money's just a tool. A hammer's useful, but it don't make you a carpenter. A few passengers nearby, who had been listening in on the conversation, exchanged glances. The tension in the air was becoming palpable, but Clint's unwavering calmness seemed to make Victor more restless. Victor set down his glass, leaning forward slightly. Let me ask you something, old man. What's the point of life if not to accumulate as much power and success as possible? What else matters? Clint studied Victor for a moment, then gave a small, knowing smile. Depends on how you define success. Some folks measure it in money. others and what they leave behind. Victor scoffed. And what do you leave behind without money? Legacy doesn't pay the bills. Clint leaned back, crossing his arms. A real legacy isn't built on money. It's built on character. You take away a man's wealth, and what's left? That's the real measure of him. Victor chuckled, but there was an edge to it. That's easy to say when you don't have anything to lose. Clint didn't react, just kept that same steady gaze. Or maybe it's easier to say when you got nothing left to prove. For the first time, Victor had no immediate response. He opened his mouth but hesitated, his mind scrambling for a comeback. The words that had come so easily before now felt empty. The flight continued, but the dynamic had shifted. Victor, who had started the journey thinking he controlled the conversation, was now on the defensive. Clint wasn't engaging in a battle of egos. He simply existed in a way that made Victor's need for dominance seem unnecessary. As dinner was served, Victor remained quieter than before. He kept glancing at Clint, as if trying to decode the enigma beside him. When the flight attendant returned to offer more drinks, Victor ordered another glass of champagne, but Clint declined any alcohol. "You don't drink?" Victor asked, not out of curiosity, but as another attempt to poke at Clint's seemingly unrefined nature. "Used to," Clint replied. "But I learned a long time ago that some things ain't worth the cost." Victor smirked. "And what was the cost?" Clint took a long moment before answering. "Time." Victor frowned. "Time?" Clint nodded. "Time wasted chasing things that don't matter. Time lost with folks who did." For the first time, Victor didn't have a smirk, a scoff, or a dismissive laugh. He simply sat back in his seat, processing Clint's words. As the plane soared through the sky, Victor found himself staring at the reflection in his champagne glass. He had spent his life chasing power, wealth, and validation. He had fought to be at the top. But at this moment, sitting beside a man who wasn't trying to impress anyone, he felt something unfamiliar. Doubt. As the flight progressed into the night, most passengers had begun to doze off. The dim cabin lights cast a soft glow over first class. Victor, unable to sleep, turned slightly toward Clint, who sat peacefully with his hat slightly tilted down. Victor cleared his throat. "You seem at peace." Clint lifted his head slightly, eyes still sharp. "Maybe." Victor hesitated before asking, "How do you do it?" Clint gave him a small smile. "Stop trying to prove something." Victor let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "You think that's what I'm doing?" Clint gave a small nod. "A man who knows who he is don't need to tell everyone." Victor swallowed hard. The conversation had started as a game to assert dominance. But now, it felt like looking in a mirror and seeing someone he wasn't sure he liked. For the first time in his life, Victor Devereaux had nothing left to say. As the plane continued its journey, something inside Victor shifted. He wasn't sure what it was yet, but for the first time in years, he felt the urge to sit in silence and think. And that, more than anything, was Clint's greatest lesson. The flight continued in silence for a while, the hum of the engines filling the cabin as most passengers began settling into the rhythm of the journey. Clint Eastwood remained as composed as ever, leaning back in his seat with an ease that made it seem as if he had been here 1,000 times before. Victor Devereaux, however, was restless. He tapped his fingers against his champagne glass, staring at the reflection of the cabin lights in the liquid. For the first time in a long time, he felt uncertain. Victor had spent his entire life building a reputation, a name that people respected or feared. Money had always been the ultimate measure of success in his world. He had spent years ensuring that he would never be looked down upon, never ignored, and never left feeling insignificant. Yet sitting next to a man who neither tried to impress him nor felt the need to justify his presence in first class, Victor was beginning to wonder if he had truly won the game he had been playing all his life. He glanced sideways at Clint, who remained quiet, his gaze fixed on the darkened sky outside the window. It was as if nothing Victor had said had even made a dent in his confidence. He wasn't sure why that made him so uneasy. Maybe because, deep down, he had been expecting Clint to react, to defend himself, to show irritation, or to at least acknowledge that Victor was superior in some way. But he hadn't, and that, more than anything, had thrown Victor off balance. The flight attendant returned, offering another round of drinks. Victor took another glass of champagne without thinking, but Clint declined again with a small shake of his head. The attendant hesitated for a moment, as if considering pressing the offer, but something about Clint's demeanor made her think better of it. She simply nodded and moved on. Victor took a long sip, then exhaled sharply. "So, you're really not going to bite, huh?" he asked, breaking the silence. Clint turned his head slightly, raising an eyebrow. "Bite?" Victor let out a dry chuckle. "I've been pushing you all flight, trying to get a reaction, and you haven't given me anything. Either you're the most patient man alive, or you just don't care." Clint considered this for a moment before answering. "A little of both, maybe." Victor sighed and leaned back in his seat. "I don't get it. Most people I meet, they either want something from me, or they want to prove something to me. You don't seem to care about either." Clint shrugged. "Not everything's a contest, son." Victor frowned, swirling the champagne in his glass. "In my world, everything is. If you don't fight for your spot, someone else will take it." Clint finally turned to look directly at Victor. "And what happens when you get there?" Victor blinked. "What do you mean?" "Say you win. You've got everything you ever wanted. Then what?" Clint asked, his voice steady calm. Victor hesitated. "Then, you keep going. You keep winning." Clint shook his head slightly. "No one wins forever. There's always a bigger fish. Always another mountain to climb. Question is, what do you do when you finally realize there ain't nothing left to chase?" Victor opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He had never really thought about that. His entire life had been a pursuit, a never-ending race for more power, more influence, more wealth. But had he ever stopped to consider where it all led, or if he even wanted to get there? The silence stretched between them, heavier this time. For the first time in years, Victor felt like he was being asked a question he didn't have an answer to. Clint leaned back in his seat again, seemingly satisfied with the conversation's pause. The older man had a way of making even the smallest moments feel significant, of forcing someone to confront things they had spent years avoiding. Victor took another sip of champagne, but this time it didn't taste as satisfying. He set the glass down, rubbing his temples. "You're a hard man to shake. You know that?" Clint gave a small smile. "Been around a long time. Seen a lot of folks try to prove they're the biggest dog in the fight." Victor let out a breath of laughter, but it was devoid of the arrogance he had displayed earlier. "Yeah? And what do you think of them?" Clint turned his gaze back to the window. "Most of them don't know what they're really fighting for. They just don't want to feel small." Victor felt his stomach tighten slightly at that. He wasn't sure if Clint was talking about him specifically, but it sure felt like it. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, to say that he was different. But was he? He had spent his whole life trying to be bigger, to be the most powerful person in the room. But for the first time, he was starting to wonder if he had been fighting a battle that didn't need to be fought at all. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, causing the lights to flicker slightly. The momentary disturbance snapped Victor out of his thoughts. He straightened in his seat, suddenly feeling exhausted. "I need some sleep," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Clint simply nodded. "Good idea. Might help you think clearer." Victor chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Yeah, maybe." He reclined his seat slightly and closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. Clint's words stayed with him, circling his mind like a vulture over a wounded animal. He had spent his life thinking that power and control were the only things that mattered. Now, for the first time, he wasn't so sure, and that uncertainty scared him more than anything else ever had. Victor Devereaux drifted in and out of sleep, his mind restless despite the gentle hum of the plane's engines. The words Clint had spoken to him kept echoing, swirling through the depths of his subconscious. He had lived his life believing that power and status were the only things that mattered, yet something about the older man's quiet confidence unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. He stirred awake after what felt like minutes, but the dim lighting in the cabin told him that time had passed. He blinked, shifting in his seat to glance at Clint, who still sat calmly, his eyes partially closed, but unmistakably aware of everything around him. The way the man carried himself, unfazed, solid, without a trace of insecurity, was beginning to gnaw at Victor's carefully constructed worldview. Feeling the need to reassert himself, Victor stretched and reached for the call button. A flight attendant promptly arrived, and he requested another glass of champagne. When she turned to Clint, he simply waved her off with a slight shake of his head. That simple refusal was somehow more telling than words. Victor wasn't sure why, but it irritated him. "So," Victor said, turning toward Clint, his tone more casual but still edged with a need to reclaim control of the conversation. "You've been around a long time, seen a lot of people. You really think all this money, power, success means nothing?" Clint turned his head slightly, studying him before speaking. "Didn't say it means nothing. Just said it don't mean what you think it does." Victor smirked. "Enlighten me." Clint exhaled through his nose, almost amused. "I've known men with more money than they knew what to do with. Men who could buy anything, go anywhere. Most of them were miserable." Victor tilted his head. "And you think being broke is better?" Clint shook his head. "Ain't about money. It's about what's left when you take all that away. What kind of man are you when there's no audience? No one watching?" Victor frowned. "Money gives you options. It makes life easier." "Maybe," Clint acknowledged. "But it don't make you better. And it sure as hell don't make you happy if you ain't already got that figured out." Victor swirled his champagne absent-mindedly. He had met plenty of men who preached about happiness being something beyond wealth, but those men had never been in his position. They had never clawed their way to the top, never felt the satisfaction of winning. And yet, here was Clint, a man who clearly had his own share of success, sitting beside him without a trace of the hunger Victor had spent his entire life cultivating. The older man's words struck something deep within him, something uncomfortable. He took a slow sip of his drink, measuring his next words carefully. "I grew up with nothing," he admitted, surprising even himself. "I watched my father break his back every day just to keep food on the table. And for what? He died with nothing to show for it." Clint nodded slightly, as if he'd heard this kind of story before. "And that's why you push so hard." Victor let out a dry laugh. "Damn right. I swore I'd never be like him. I swore I'd have enough power that no one could ever make me feel small." Clint looked at him with an expression Victor couldn't quite read. Understanding, but also something deeper. "And yet here you are sitting in first class with all the power you could ever want, still trying to prove something." Victor stiffened slightly. He opened his mouth to retort, but found himself at a loss for words. The realization hit him harder than he expected. Had he really spent his entire life fighting to prove himself, only to end up feeling just as uncertain as before? The plane hit a small pocket of turbulence, causing the drinks on their trays to rattle. Victor clenched his jaw, staring at the golden liquid in his glass. He could feel Clint's eyes on him, waiting but not pressuring. The silence between them stretched, heavier than before. After what felt like an eternity, Victor spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "You ever regret anything?" Clint let out a breath, nodding slightly. "Ain't a man alive who doesn't. Question is, do you learn from it, or do you let it eat you up?" Victor stared straight ahead, his mind running through every deal, every manipulation, every moment he had stepped on someone else to get ahead. He had never stopped to think about the cost, not just to others, but to himself. The flight attendant came by again, collecting glasses and checking in on passengers. When she reached their row, Victor surprised himself by waving off another drink. The attendant nodded and moved on, leaving him alone with his thoughts. For the first time in years, Victor wasn't sure what he was chasing anymore, and that realization was terrifying. Clint leaned back in his seat, tilting his hat slightly forward as if to rest, but Victor knew he was still paying attention. The older man had given him something to think about, something real, something he couldn't just dismiss. And as the plane continued its journey through the dark sky, Victor found himself staring at his own reflection in the window, wondering if he even recognized the man staring back at him anymore. Victor sat in silence, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him more than he cared to admit. He had never considered that his life, built on power and wealth, could still leave him feeling so empty. He was always moving forward, always chasing the next deal, the next acquisition, the next moment to prove he was the strongest in the room. And yet, sitting next to Clint Eastwood, a man who had lived longer, seen more, and yet carried himself with quiet certainty, made Victor realize just how much of his life had been spent running from something he couldn't even name. The plane continued its course through the night sky, a quiet hum filling the cabin as the other passengers either slept or busied themselves with entertainment. But Victor was wide awake, staring at his hands as if they held answers to questions he had never asked himself before. Clint remained still, his presence steady, unmoving. He wasn't waiting for Victor to speak, nor was he pushing him toward anything. And yet, somehow, that made Victor feel even more like he needed to say something. "I don't even know what I'd do if I stopped," Victor finally admitted, his voice lower than before, as if confessing something he didn't want anyone else to hear. "If I wasn't building, fighting, proving myself, I don't know who I'd be." Clint slowly turned his head toward him, eyes sharp but not unkind. "That's the thing, son. If who you are depends on what you do, then you got it backward." Victor frowned, looking at Clint like he had just spoken another language. "What's that supposed to mean?" Clint exhaled, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. "You spend all your time building an empire, making sure the world knows your name. But let me ask you, who are you when none of that matters? Take away the money, the suits, the private jets. What's left?" Victor hesitated. No one had ever asked him that. No one had ever dared to. His entire life had been about creating an identity that couldn't be questioned, that commanded respect. But Clint wasn't questioning his wealth or his success. He was questioning what existed underneath it. And that was the part Victor wasn't sure he had an answer for. "I built everything I have," Victor finally said, his voice harder now, almost defensive. "No one gave me anything. I fought for my place in the world." Clint nodded slowly. "And what happens when you don't have to fight anymore?" Victor opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. He clenched his fists, then relaxed them. He had always believed there would be another battle, another challenge, another way to prove himself. But what if there wasn't? What if there came a day when he had nothing left to prove? Would he even know how to exist without the fight? The silence between them stretched, but this time it felt heavier, more final. Clint's words weren't meant to break him down, but to make him think. And that was exactly what they were doing. A voice came over the intercom, announcing that they would be landing soon. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, preparing passengers for descent. Victor barely noticed. He was still lost in thought, his mind replaying every moment of his life when he had been fighting to be the most powerful man in the room. And for the first time, he wondered if it had ever really made him happy. The flight attendant stopped by their row, smiling politely. "Mr. Eastwood, the captain wanted me to pass along his regards. He's a big fan." Victor blinked, the words barely registering at first. And then, like a slap to the face, realization hit him. "Eastwood. Clint Eastwood." His head snapped toward Clint, his eyes widening slightly. "You're Clint Eastwood." Clint gave a small nod, as if the name meant nothing to him. "That's what they call me." Victor let out a breath, leaning back in his seat. "I should have recognized you." Clint shrugged. "Don't make much difference." Victor shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "No wonder you didn't react to anything I said. You've probably seen people like me 100 times before." Clint smirked, but there was no malice in it. "A few." Victor exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "And here I was trying to impress you. Or maybe trying to prove something. I don't even know anymore." Clint adjusted his hat, giving Victor one last steady look. "You don't gotta prove anything to me, son. The only person you need to prove something to is yourself." Victor let those words sink in as the plane began its descent. He wasn't sure what to do with them yet, wasn't sure if he even knew how to apply them to his life. But for the first time in years, he felt something shift. He wasn't sure if it was regret, or realization, or maybe just exhaustion from the years of trying to be someone he wasn't even sure he wanted to be anymore. As the wheels touched the runway, Victor sat up straighter, his hands clasped together as he stared ahead. He had spent his whole life believing he had everything figured out. And yet, after one conversation with a man who didn't even try to challenge him, he felt more uncertain than ever. Passengers began gathering their belongings, preparing to disembark. Victor stayed seated for a moment, watching as Clint stood up, grabbing his simple leather bag from the overhead compartment. There was nothing extravagant about the man, and yet he carried himself with more presence than anyone Victor had ever met. Before Clint could step past him, Victor found himself speaking. "Eastwood." Clint stopped, turning back slightly. "Yeah." Victor hesitated, then extended his hand. "Thanks." Clint looked at the outstretched hand for a moment before shaking it firmly. "Take care, son." And with that, he walked off the plane, disappearing into the crowd of passengers moving through the terminal. Victor sat there for a long moment, watching him go. Then, slowly, he grabbed his own bag and stood up. As he stepped into the airport, the weight on his shoulders felt different. Lighter, maybe? Or just changed? For the first time in years, Victor Devereaux wasn't sure what came next. And maybe, just maybe, that was the point.